this so that we can have it later. Welcome to the CEO Conversation. I'm excited to have Diana Peterson-More with us today. Diana is a wonderful woman CEO, a tremendous leader in corporate life and for companies of different sizes. And today she runs her own consulting practice. She is author of the book, Consequential Communications in Turbulent Times. And she focuses on the importance of a leader's voice and how they communicate. And I'm just delighted to call her a colleague, and I'm delighted to call her a friend. So I'm excited for our conversation today because we can talk about the importance of conversation and communication. And this definitely is a turbulent time. So welcome, Diana. Thank you for being here today.
Well, I'm thankful for your hosting me, and I'm ready to get going.
Very good. Well, one of the questions I wanted to lead off with, I love your book, and I'd highly recommend any leader to read it because the case studies that you unpack in that book is so appropriate for leaders of companies of any size. But you know, the title of your book is about consequential communication in turbulent times. We're definitely in a turbulent time. Is there some piece of advice that you might give to leaders and CEOs about the importance of their voice or how they communicate during this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall right now, people are obviously nervous, concerned, fearful, some considerably more than that. Some are having a lot of mental health issues, which is unfortunate and sad. The uncertainty. I actually wrote a blog last week on the lizard brain being that part of our brain that kind of drives immediate responses. And I've noticed both in my own communications, both in delivering and in receiving, I know I'm a little bit more sensitive than I typically am. And so I think it's really important to think first and speak second. Take what is called the 15-second pause. And by the way, Ken knows this, all of the stories, the how-tos, etc. in my book are from experiences that either I had personally going up through the corporate world or those I've encountered as a consultant. I was told early on in my career, when as I'm fond of saying, was making a meteoric rise to the glass ceiling, that I needed to take the 15-second pause, that I had a tendency to be a trumpet, brain out as opposed to a French horn, brain and think about it and then exhale. And it's good advice. I do have that tendency to speak quickly, so I do think first. And I think now it's more important than ever because we're dealing with uncertainty and fear.
Well, I did love that blog post about the lizard brain. I thought that was a catchy.
Well, it's actually true. We do have that part of our brain, and it's a survival instinct, so it's a very good thing. But it's the fight or flight mechanism, and when we're experiencing fear, we kind of go back into that mode. It's normal, it's natural. So that's why it's important to kind of slow down, take a 15-second pause, think first. And I'm also big on being strategic. What's the goal that one wants to achieve? And I actually had an experience this morning where a friend of mine texted me about something that was on PBS that she and I both enjoyed. And I was aware of it. So rather than say to her, yes, I know about it, I thought, well, she was trying to be kind. So all I said was, thank you for the heads up. I'm going to be engaged later this morning, so I'll probably put it on DVR. So I was able to acknowledge her kindness and her thinking about me in a way that would show her that, as opposed to, yes, I'm already aware of it and I've got it on DVR.
Well, even your comment about the trumpet and the French horn, boy, that's how powerful is that to just pause for a second, to think about how we're communicating. I talk about leaders, and I know you work with CEOs and business owners as well. And, we have, I call them diamonds, right? Or us diamonds, because, when we look at something, we're looking at it through 15 different lenses. How will this impact payroll? How will it impact our team culture? All these different aspects. And we can speak out of any one of those moments, like, and probably the one that's the most painful or the one that is the most impactful to us. So that
Yeah.
the trumpet, but that French horn mentality of, let me pause for a second. Which area, which area of focus do I want to focus on? Is there
Hmm.
any other tools that you teach or that you have on how do we pause, or how do we get, to think through how do we communicate in an effective way? What's most critical? I know you talk about some of those in your book, obviously.
Well, I think what happens a lot, I was someone, even as a child, I was always raising my hand in class, and I assumed, it's the old assuming facts, not in evidence. I assumed that if somebody had something to say, they would raise their hand, or in the workplace, they would speak out. But that's not true. A lot of people want to be invited to speak. And so I'm a trained facilitator. I do a lot of facilitation. So I will look around the room, and I will chide the over participators by saying, I am one of you, I'm an over participator. But I will start to ask those who are earnestly engaged, you can tell by the whites of their eyes, but not volunteering to speak. And I think what happens is you recognize that those individuals often have the most powerful statements to make, and they often have the best contributions, but they're overlooked because they are not the ones who are volunteering their voice. So another lesson that I try to practice myself is to listen, listen more, ask more, and kind of tell less. And let's face it, people who are CEOs are there because they're bright, they're capable, they understand what's going on, they're used to achieving. And so they have a tendency to tell as opposed to listen and ask. And listening and asking, guess what? Sometimes you might even learn something. Oftentimes, somebody else will articulate your very good idea, but the fact that somebody else has articulated it, they own it, and they're more engaged. So I'd say seek out those who wouldn't necessarily volunteer and ask.
Mm. Boy, that's powerful for us to think about, just that whole concept of, paying attention to who isn't necessarily being involved, who may
Mm-hmm.
have something to say, but they aren't necessarily volunteering that. I think that's very helpful. And the power of questions, right? The know what
Yeah.
questions to ask, thinking about questions before we think about statements. We're going to talk a little bit about email in just a little bit, because I love some of your strategies where it comes to communicating at a distance. How would you, just, I'm curious, this is kind of off the cuff question, but I think it's powerful. Um, how do you ask questions on an email? I mean, have you thought through, and what advice is it? Because, a lot of times email is that direct telling, here's,
Boy, yeah, it's at our fingertips, and we often just get it off our chest without recognizing that we're making a permanent record. It's
right,
kind of the old adage in the good old days, or the bad old days when we wrote memos, and the advice was never write anything a memo that you wouldn't want on the front of page of the LA Times or the New York Times or whatever your local newspaper is. And we don't, we kind of weren't alone often when we're writing an email. It's like this, it's that lizard brain. It's getting it off our chest and just sending it out without recognizing how it might be perceived. One of the things that I do is that I'll put things in draft form and wait and go back and look at it. And then I also have a couple of trusted advisors, people I know who know me well, they have my best interests at heart, and I will run it by them and take their advice, uh, because when that anger or that disappointment comes up, uh, tends to come out in emails. I think the other thing about emails is that we tend not to, well, one of my big bugaboos is the subject line, because oftentimes you start a conversation and it starts to change, but the subject line never changes. So this has happened to me where the subject line's the exact same, and I thought, oh well, I already read that one, when in fact the content has changed. So I think it's important to really change the subject line and be kind of specific, and then also, who are we copying, and why are we copying somebody? I think it's important, if you want a response, to say, meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. Let me know if you can attend, or this is for information only, don't need to hear back, especially as a CEO, because I think when a CEO speaks or writes an email, everyone thinks it's now top priority. And sometimes she or he may just be, getting something off the chest. So I think it's important to be able to say, for information only, need a response by end of day, need a response in a week or whatever. The other thing about questions, Ken, because I think something I learned. My last boss was somebody who did not like to be asked direct questions. He felt that they were assaultive. So if I would ask, what do you think, or why are we doing this? He was quiet, wouldn't say anything. So I hired somebody who was an organizational development consultant who did then what I do today. And it was a he, and he said to me, try reframing and try asking the question with how. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, that's really ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. But I tried it. I made it into a game. And so instead of saying, what do you think? I'd say, well, how about if we did X, Y, or Z? And all of a sudden, he was very chatty. And I realized that by reframing the question that appeared to be, from his point of view, less assaultive, I guess, less direct, that I was able to get what I wanted. And it wasn't a huge compromise. I would never ask somebody to do something where they felt their ethics or their persona was being compromised, but it wasn't a big compromise for me to change how I asked questions. So I'm pretty careful now about that. I also, as you know, I try to eliminate you and own everything and say I. I was thinking about how about if we do, or I noticed that this happened. It kind of, as opposed to saying you did X, Y, and Z, to say I noticed that this happened. Tell me about it. And when questions are framed in a gentler fashion, in my experience is it engenders more conversation. And after all, that's what it's all about.
Thank you for that. I think those are helpful pieces of information for any leader. Even in marketing, we're going to have Steve Robinson on Friday, who was the chief marketing officer for Chick-fil-A. And, the whole idea of questions in marketing, they tell us today, is so much more impactful. So when you send out a marketing email, in the title, to make it a question, and it encourages the receiver of that email to open it up, because you're not just telling them something, you're asking them to come in. But I really think that how question is really a powerful tool for us as leaders. And even, go ahead.
And I know for me, I was going to say, excuse me, as a consultant, my goal is to deliver what people want. And if I have misread the situation or don't have it, I'm not going to get the job. So I will often, in conversation with a client, the first time out, I'll say, let me, I'm not 100% sure I understood what you were asking. Let me try this out. What I heard was X, Y, and Z. And they will tell you yes, no, or maybe. If they tell you yes, you're on the right track. If they tell you no, that's really good information too, because I want to deliver what they want. So I think in my own work life, as well as in my personal life, just because I've changed from being the leader and the executive, I'm asking more, listening more, and only telling as a recap.
Yeah, I actually say one of the most important statements that a company can learn is that statement that you just talked about. So what I'm hearing you say is, and then you restate it back, right? And whether that's dealing in customer service, right? If a customer comes in and they're saying this, and we say, well, here's what I heard you say that you wanted, or here's what I heard from an order perspective or a complaint perspective, it lets the customer feel very loved. Every leader or CEO needs to practice that with their team, right? The team comes in, the CEO, before he or she responds, they should say, well, what I heard you say was this. And then many times when I talk to employees, I say, hey, one of the first lessons you need to learn is when your leader says something to you, say, hey, I heard you say this. Is that
Mhm.
correct? And then
Mhm.
it solves a lot of miscommunication in companies. And the biggest value, just what you talked about, is that it makes people believe you're listening. You're actively listening. You're really trying to listen to understand what the other person was saying. So that's
Yeah, and I'm not sure as a consultant this is applicable, and I'm not sure it's 100% with the CEO. But one of the other things I do is I think strategically. So I want to know what success looks like. So I'll say, what does success look like at the end of this project or this training or this coaching? It will have been successful if what happens. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, the person hasn't thought about it that way. So then he or she kind of reformulates. And I'll say, or asked another way, for you to get your money's worth, as opposed to this being a waste of time and waste of money, what needs to happen? And a friend of mine, a coach, he was really upset that I do this because his life's blood is just having these ongoing, kind of like I would analogize it to Freudian psychiatry versus kind of Skinnerian short-term results. And I'm pretty short term that way from the standpoint that I think we need to define success and work towards it. And if the person is, and and the chief indicator of success is his or her desire and willingness to change. And if it's not there, then I have backed out of coaching assignments because I feel like it's kind of a waste of money and a waste of time. And as I said, I have a friend whose ideal is to have, he's really funny, 10 CEOs of middle market companies. I meet with each of them once a month. I charge each of them $1,000. So I'm bringing in $10,000 a month, and it's for a year or whatever. And I just, great if that works out, but somehow, to me, if I'm not seeing the change and the progress, I feel uncomfortable.
Mhm, mhm. And I know we're going to have some questions around the email in just a second. So if you guys have a question, you can raise your hand or you can post it. I'll unmute you so you can ask Diana specifically as it relates to email or questions. I think would be I don't want to move on from that because I know that it's so critical. Back to the whole draft email component and even the question piece. I think I love that draft email tool, right? Because what'll happen from the lizard brain, what you're talking about, is
Yeah.
somebody might ask me a question or respond. I'll go in and type things away real quick because I'm processing all those different angles, right? And but then I'll just save it to a draft, and I'll say, well, wait a second, let me send an email back as a question, or let me send an email back where I want to understand more of why they're asking this question of me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and it changes, but I still got all that work because it's still in the draft email, right? And so when I ask that question back, sometimes they'll send me back the information that I'm looking for, or we'll be on the same page. I might just copy and paste something out of the draft, never send the entire
Mm-hmm.
email, but boy, what a helpful tool that is.
I think for me, I found it to be successful to say to someone, help me understand.
Mm.
Um, and what I'm really looking for is the specific structured communication. Ken apparently read my lizard brain blog, but what's interesting about that, it had to do, and the example was a real life example, which was I'm in a couple of book clubs, and this particular book club happened to be through my local Rotary chapter. We're called Rotary Readers, which is interesting because they're both women and men, as opposed to the typical all-female book club. And I thought, wow, we were doing it on Zoom. And it's usually a little bit free form, but I thought, that's not going to work. So I put together an agenda. I then went and off on the internet and looked for reader questions for this particular book, sent them out to everybody and said, tell me which question you want to answer. Because I thought, gosh, if we don't, we'll be talking over each other. It'll be like herding cats. And I found in my personal life, which Rotary is basically, although I have a lot of work colleagues there, as opposed to a work life, people get really kind of like, well, who do you think you are? And who put you in charge of changing the structure? And so my response was, it may not work, but let's give it a try. And if it works, great. And the person who facilitates next month may want to do something else. And, of course, at the end of the day, it did work fairly well. It wasn't perfect because we were struggling with the technology, frankly. However, I just kind of feel like email, Zoom, other kinds of meetings that are atypical or actually meetings, it's really important to have a timed agenda. It's really important to have the people there who should be there based upon skill sets and competencies as opposed to the usual suspects. And to say, Ken, I'm inviting you to this meeting. There'll be 5 of us there. I'd like you to spend 10 minutes talking about how you created the CEO experience or something like that. And then why you're being asked. And then at the end of the meeting, there's kind of deliverables as opposed to these, how many meetings have we all sat in that kind of just go on, drone on and on and on, and we don't know what the purpose is. So I tend to be kind of very, focused. What's the goal? What am I trying to achieve? And then I back into it and put together a structure that I believe will support it. And then not perfect, so always do an assessment. What worked, what didn't work, what will I do differently next time?
Right. Well, I love that flexibility and that creativity. I think so many meetings become the same because we just feel like that's what the meeting has to look like. And I thought your blog really highlighted the fact that, hey, listen, timing is different, situation is different. Let's kind of look at this in a different way. And I'm not against, rituals. I think that's good. I think sometimes where it comes to meetings, we get into that rigidity, maybe where it becomes so has to be one way, and we forget the purpose, just what you're talking about. What is the purpose of this meeting? Why are we coming together? And could there be different ways to look at it?
Mm-hmm. And also, to me, if it's a skill-based meeting, if it's who is the person with the most knowledge on the topic, it shares leadership. It invites, as opposed to having the head of the department or whomever, it invites participation from the experts. And the more the merrier. The more people that are engaged and involved, the more motivated they are. And I mean, one thing we know is motivated employees are more productive employees, so it really helps the bottom line. And again, it's an opportunity to learn.
Excellent. Do we have any questions related to email or even meetings, or kind of that lizard brain that we were talking about of just the natural response? No, I mean, I love that. It's a good visual of, hey, I'm just responding out of my emotion. I'm responding out of my natural stance. I need to think through, how do I respond in an effective way? I'm just curious. I've got a couple more questions. I want to move into a different direction, but I want to give anybody a chance. We'll have some time at the end as well if you want to answer any questions. Hey, Diana, one of the questions that I had on email specifically, and then I want to talk about women CEOs as well, but is there, I mean, obviously right now there's a lot of telework and distance, and we know that communication in person is usually more effective because you can read body language and all those kinds of things. Do you have a rule for when you should pick up the phone versus send an email or potentially schedule a video conference, or what rule of thumb would you use for companies today that you would tell them, hey, it's good to do this via email, but these are real conversations that you really need to have in person?
Yeah, well, I step back a little bit, and to me, there's the golden rule of communication. The golden rule being I communicate with you the way I want to be communicated with. We're all familiar with the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I believe in the platinum rule, which is I should be communicating with someone else with the way that is most effective for him or her. So some people are all over the map. Some people like a phone call. Some people like a text message. Some people like an email. And you can ask, actually, and most will tell you. Or if they don't know, you can try one or the other topics. I would definitely say, however, that said, kind of as the underlying, It depends upon the nature of the communication. You know, the old adage, praise in public, discipline in private. I think if it's going to be anything that is either intended to be or could be perceived as negative or someone being called out, that a phone call, a really quick phone call. Gee, I need 5 minutes of your time. What's a good time to talk? Or I need 5 minutes of your time on the phone. These are the slots that are open for me. Let me know. Um, and Also, if there's emails that have gone back and forth, and if you're not getting what you want, you know, I'm the believer that it's my responsibility to make sure I'm understood. It's not your responsibility to understand me, which
Right.
is a switch in the paradigm. So once again, it's my job to make sure I'm understood. It's not your job to understand me. So I'll do this if I'm facilitating a group sometimes. I will look around and I'll see, you know, I can tell visually when people are understanding. And if there are people who don't appear to understand, I will often say, you know, I'm even confusing myself. So Ken, would you like to repeat what you thought I said? To rephrase it, I'll say the same thing more than once, and then I'll say it somewhat differently, and then I'll ask somebody to engage. But it's kind of the same way as figuring out how somebody receives communication and then delivering it that way.
Yeah, boy, that platinum rule I think is fantastic, right? Thinking through, and even again from a customer perspective, thinking through how they want to be receive information. You know,
Yeah.
we have so many more means today to receive communication than probably ever in the past, right? And
Hmm.
so to when a new customer comes on board, to ask them, hey, do you like to receive information via text or email or in person over the
Hmm.
phone or on our website or on social media?
Hmm.
And just to ask that question, most companies don't do that, and yet, and then we unsubscribe or we get rid of that communication message. Where if they would have just asked and said, "Hey, how would you have liked to hear from information from our company, or how
Right.
would you like to hear information?" It
Yeah.
changes the whole game.
Yeah. I mean, we often forget to ask people what they want, and they don't always know, honestly, but many people do know. And so, phew, that's right. You know, that's off your list. And then after that, you can try different methods or modes. You know,
Mhm.
if you don't get them, I prefaced my book by a law school professor, and he was a contracts professor. And I, to this day, don't remember what the contract concept was. But he used to say, if you don't get them on the swings, get them on the merry-go-round. If you don't get them on the merry-go-round, get them on the slides. If you don't get them on the slides, get them on the monkey bar. And I really think that's what happens with communication. We all communicate differently. And if you try one method or mode and it's successful, great. But if not, try a different method or mode. And it could be just rephrasing something verbally. It could be sending an email. It could be a text message. It could be picking up the phone. And then once you've found that sweet spot, whatever that sweet spot might be, that's the way to continue to deliver information.
Right. And just really quick, I loved your thought about picking up the phone and having a difficult conversation with somebody, kind of praising in public and reprimanding.
Discipline and private. Yeah, that's, I mean, as you know, I was a practicing employment lawyer, so I'm very familiar with that. But it's true. I mean, people, you know, we've all done this. I've done it. Out of frustration, you might, again, the lizard brain, you might blurt something out in the hallway that might be negative or whatever. The power of apology. It's really important to apologize for that and and move on and say, you know, I'm really sorry. I blurted that out. I apologize. I'll do my best never to do it again. Um, and people, especially when bosses apologize to employees, very powerful.
Right. When I was going to say about even having those difficult conversations at one point, I was managing a remote team, and
Mm-hmm.
I made it a rule that I was always going to have those difficult conversations over the phone or by
Mm-hmm.
video conference. And then because I just believed in, the human interaction. And I mean, even the smallest difficult conversation, I would just pick up the phone. I felt like that was a better way for us to communicate. But then what I'd have to do is send a follow-up email a lot of times after the fact and just say, hey, this is what we talked about. But then I could be very pragmatic, very specific,
Mhm.
as a record, if I needed to, from an employee situation, or even for my own benefit of what I was sending to them. But then there wasn't any misunderstanding because it was after the fact. We'd already talked about it. I was restating facts, if you will. There wasn't the emotional component that we often have as leaders that happens sometimes in the emails if we don't have that person
It's
interaction.
also effective, Ken, in those situations to ask the other person to document what he or she understood you to say.
I agree.
Because, again, my last corporate job, I was head of human resources for the Times Mere company, which no longer exists. And I put in this kind of, at the time, interesting, new, cutting edge performance management system where we started at the beginning of each year with goals, and then we met on a quarterly basis and, where are you, and gave frequent feedback. A lot of people say, oh my goodness, but you're devoting an hour every 3 months. So who can't deliver, who can't give up 4 or 5 hours? And I had 6 direct reports. And at the end of the year, I had them write their job performance. And 5 of them were spot on. And the 6th person was like totally out to lunch. And I realized that the communication hadn't penetrated. So I went back and I said, okay, because I kept notes, on this date we talked about this, and this date we talked about that. But I learned a lesson. So the following year, each time I had a quarterly meeting, I had all 6 of them just recap what we talked about and send me an email. That way, if I were not clear or did not communicate effectively, I could correct the situation.
Mm, yeah, that's helpful. That disconnect a lot of times happens, right? We think we're
Yeah.
communicating, but we're really not. They hear something different than we say, or even we're not saying it. I've learned that I have certain communication gaps, if you will, or faults that I think in my head I'm saying something, but
Yes.
but the reality is people aren't necessarily hearing it as I'm saying, and I've had to learn through the years figuring out what those blind spots are so I know how to communicate better or how to try to stop those gaps. So having them come back is a big deal. That's
Well,
excellent.
I think we also all have a different base of knowledge. And as the leader, you have a greater base of knowledge. So we assume that other people have that same base of knowledge. And in fact, the blog I'm working on now is kind of a joke on me. My daughter and I, Trader Joe's started in Pasadena, California, where I am, where I live. And we found somebody who would shop for us because of the coronavirus. And so I put together my list and I said tomatoes as opposed to heirloom tomatoes. So I got a little container of all these teeny tiny tomatoes. And I realized, boy, I was assuming that this person would know what I wanted. And then I actually also put something about canned tomatoes in the green can, which was really, and there turned out to be canned tomatoes in the green can, but what I was really looking for was the marinara sauce in the green can. So I laughed at myself and I realized, boy, I just violated one of my own rules. I assumed facts, not in evidence. I assumed this person would know exactly what I was talking about. My daughter did the same thing. So lettuce comes in packages of 3. So I guess she said something about she wanted the 3 package. So she got 3 packages of 3 heads of lettuce each. So anyway, it was just, so we chuckled about it and decided that we had to be a lot clearer the next time we ventured out.
Right. Well, I think to your point, and this is why I appreciate your work so much and appreciate our partnership in many ways. I think so many hours of productivity, so much effectiveness is lost in companies
Oh
just
yeah.
from poor communication, right? And
Oh,
just,
absolutely. I
you know,
mean, I did some research on it for a presentation I was making, and I don't recall off the top of my head. However, it was actually frightening because somebody had done the research and they talked about time and then they translated into dollars, huge amounts of money lost
Mhm.
in corporations due to miscommunication. And then the resulting oftentimes hurt feelings, loss of productivity, and so forth. So, I mean, to me, it's all about motivating employees to do their best work. And I say to myself, as long as I'm not compromising a sense of ethics or whatever, as long as I can communicate in a way that they respond and deliver and are motivated to continue to deliver, then I've done my job.
That's right. Hey, I have another quick question, then I'll open it up. If you guys have a question, I'll let you ask Diana specifically, or you can put it in the chat box. Diana, one of the things that I'm very interested in today, especially with the rise of the women CEO, at CEO Experience, we have women CEO groups, and we have multiple companies that we serve that are led by women CEOs, and I think they're outstanding, and I'm excited about what the future looks like. As you've done your work on communication, and obviously being a woman CEO and coming up through the ranks and leading the way for future generations, do you have any insight on how women may communicate differently in business, or how they should communicate differently, or maybe even how men should communicate differently to women CEOs?
That's such a fascinating question. And this is going to sound a little bit odd, because I think there are some gender-based differences. However, I don't think they're exclusive to either gender. In other words, I think there are more female ways of communicating that men do quite well. And there's some more traditionally male ways of communicating that some women adopt, I think, to their detriment. In general, and I think, by the way, successful leaders that have both. One of my jobs at Southern California Edison Company was as the corporate secretary, which meant in those days there were monthly board meetings. So I would sit in the board meetings, and it was fascinating to observe, because in those days it was largely male dominated. There were a couple of females that were, two females. One happened to have been the daughter of a CEO of another utility, and the other one was a member of a very wealthy, prestigious Los Angeles-based family. But the men who were most successful to me had adopted both the female and male characteristics. And what I mean by that is that I think men tend to be very focused and very goal-oriented and very directive in their conversation and communication. Women tend to listen and ask more and to multitask. And I realized that those ones who were the great leaders were the ones, and they happened to have been men because there were more men on the board, who had both that laser-like focus, but listened, asked, were gentle in their communication, and were capable of multitasking. And I remember thinking at the time that as a female and a multitasker by nature, goes back to hunter-gatherer days when the men were focused on killing and the women were gathering and taking care of everybody, that it would be easier for me to adopt more of that laser-like focus, and it probably would be for a lot of men to be kind of more multitask oriented, and also a little bit asking more and telling less. And I have to say, I did one of my first podcasts right after, I guess was Mary Barra head of GM? I think it's GM. And there was something on 60 Minutes in which she was being questioned. And I thought to myself, boy, she was doing, to me, all of the kind of traditional male boom, 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 rat-a-tat-tat, tell, also a little bit defensive. And I thought, boy, to me, she would have really benefited from adopting more of what I would call some of the female characteristics. I would also say in my own career, being a baby boomer and starting out, that I noticed there were what I called men's women and women's women. And the men's women were those women who felt like they had to be more macho than the guys, and they often were not very nice people, honestly. And I did my best to stay away from them. And those that were kind of the women's women, to me, were the ones that were multitaskers. They asked a lot more. They engaged the workforce. That's according to I have a son and two daughters, and according to my daughters, it's because I keep thinking, oh, it's changed so much. According to them, it hasn't changed quite as much as I think. But, we're on that path of growth and change. So again, I would say I wouldn't necessarily, I think there are gender-based differences in communication and in style and in leadership, but they're not unique only to those genders. And I think the most successful leaders are those who can adopt both. I don't know
I
if that makes sense, but it does to me.
Oh, I think it's fantastic, and of course I look at Jesus as one of the best leaders, and I see him having those multiple abilities. He
Yeah.
asked lots of questions. Matter of fact, he started most of his conversations with
Hmm.
questions, right? And then of course there were times that he could be very directive and give communication to his disciples,
Well,
or
and very forgiving and giving people a second chance. I mean, gosh, Mary Magdalene, for Pete's sakes.
that's right. We were just on a CEO call this morning, or one of the CEO retreat days, and it was filled with women. And one of the conversations that got brought up was the one we were just talking about. That I think people are more sensitive today of different forms of communication, different styles of communication, maybe even who I'm communicating to. And I think those are all great advances that we've made. But I do think there are times that, and we were talking about, this was a woman CEO that had actually been talked down to just in a contracting relationship by a male peer. And, and he had to come back, and he recognized what he was doing. He apologized for it, thankfully. But, those things still happen from time to time. So what advice would you give a woman that is in that situation, and maybe she's received negative conversation or being talked down to because she's a woman CEO? How would you, I know you had to battle that yourself, right?
Oh yeah, and I'm chuckling a little bit because recently, and I turn it around and I say, I'm sorry, what did I say to cause the reaction?
Hmm.
And boy, that switches things immediately, because it gets them to think about the reaction and gets them to think about, why did it even happen? Um, the other thing I've done, this is really funny. My next door neighbor happens to be Jed the Fish, if anybody ever listened to K-Rock or listens to syndicated rock and roll. Very interesting guy. And he has a dog and I have a dog, and there's these barking battles. And he wrote kind of a nasty email to me and to a new family on the other side of his house about the dogs. And I just wrote back and I said, oh, Jed, you're so funny. That's all I said. And this brand new person sends me an email and said, what was that all about? And I said, well, the old adage, he who lives in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. He's very quick to point out if somebody else's dog does something that's offensive, but never owns up when his dog does. So I find humor works, but for me, and again, this is where the trumpet comes in handy, because I've thought about these things. It happened recently where someone spoke down to me, happened to have been a man, and I said, excuse me, what did I say to cause that reaction? And he just, I mean, he was like back on his heels almost. Or the other issue is, I have found, if I'm about to say a lizard brain thing, I zip my lip and I come back the next day. And this happened to me again at Times Mirror, the one person who didn't understand the performance issues came into my office and said something, and I was upset, and I knew I was. So I said, this isn't a good time. We're going to stop this meeting. Would you please leave? Of course, the person didn't, so I got up and left, fuming. Called one of my trusted advisors that night to see if maybe I had overreacted. No. So I went in the next day and I called this person in and I said, do you know why the meeting was canceled last night? I said, I was angry and I was about to say something that you and I both would have regretted. I'm still angry, and let me tell you why. And boy, when you can calmly describe an emotion like anger or disappointment, a lot more powerful. Now, had I flown off the handle, oh, well, there she goes again, flying off the handle, it's very easy to dismiss somebody else. So being the natural born trumpet, I try to moderate, but also if I'm getting angry or the lizard brain's coming up, I have a physical reaction and I can tell it. So that's when I zip the lip and have the conversation later.
Boy, that's helpful. Hey, we're going to take a couple of questions in a second. If you have a question, put it in the chat box. I've got a ton more questions for you, Diana. But to that last point, well, I think this topic is so intriguing, and
Yeah.
I love it.
What's interesting about these Zoom meetings is you get to see what everybody has. And I'm in my father had a company called Rattan Craft of California, so I have a lot of Chinese things which are in evidence right now. But it's fun to see other people's homes, and in some of the pictures, there's a lot of books, interesting colors on the walls, and so that's a different element to this. We get to learn things about other people that we wouldn't necessarily have known.
That's right. That's right. You were talking about the pausing and waiting for a few days. You know, I talk about the whole person, and that
Mm-hmm.
I've learned a lot of lessons from home that I take into business, and learned a lot of lessons in business that I bring into the home. Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I had to learn. I call it the 24-hour rule. When
Yeah.
I've got 4 children. My oldest is now 25, and
Mm-hmm.
a girl I had. The oldest was a girl, and then I had 3 boys. And she's wonderful. I'm proud of her. She's doing fantastic work. She's out on her own. But when she was a teenager, she was a good kid. But when she got to be that teenager, she kind of gave me a run for my money, and she knew how to push dad's buttons on occasion, you know. And I had to finally get to that place because she would probably make me more upset or mad than I've ever been with anybody most in my
Yeah.
life. Pretty even keeled, right? But she would do something or push my button in some way. And I finally got to the place where I said, okay, I need to calm down and think about it. And so I would tell her, like, she would, do something and I'd have to punish her. And I'd say, hey, we're going to talk about this 24 hours from today.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about it. And what I actually found was that was a great punishment for her because, now she's waiting for 24 hours to figure out what's going to happen. And what I ended up doing was the more mad I got or the more upset I got was the longer I waited. So
Yeah.
there were 24-hour periods and there were 3-day periods. And then
Yeah, I chuckle because I have 3 children. I have a son and 2 daughters, and I try to have I try to follow my own rules when I'm having conversations with them. And I'll get the response, "Oh, Mom, you're just talking about something out of your book." And I'll say, "Yes, because it works." "Well, don't try it on me," is the response I get.
So now I brought that into the business world, and I used to tell my team, I don't get much mad any longer, but I would do the same thing. I'd say, okay, I'm not going to make a decision. And I actually apply that to decision making, not just communication, right? Because
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm pausing for 24 hours or 3 days or a week. But I set that time limit because then it lets me kind of, I'm guessing initially how long I think it's going to take me, but then I can come back and I say, well, this is a 3-day decision or it's a 3-day conversation. I need to wait 3 days
Yeah.
or I need to wait 24 hours or whatever it is. So
The other thing that I do, and it's one of the examples in the book, is that when I was corporate secretary at Edison, again, we had monthly board meetings, and it was always a fire drill. But there were about 50 people in the department because there was also this whole stock transfer, dividend reinvestment, this whole other arm. And I remember when I was under pressure, because I would be, because I also, unlike my predecessor who would stay till 9 or 10 at night, I had to run pick up children at childcare. Which, by the way, I was pregnant my last year of law school, and having had children when I started my career was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced a kind of discipline that I don't think I would have had. So one day, one of the assistant secretaries walked into the office and had a question, and I said, this isn't a good time for me. Can it wait? No, have to have it resolved now. And I said, okay, well, I only have 5 minutes. I always call that announcing your intentions, being very clear. And we might end up with a decision that's not so great, and we're going to have to implement it. So sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I don't even remember what the problem was, but the person came in to ask for a response, and I gave it, and it ended up being a lousy decision. So one of the things that I realized is in that moment is to say, this really is not a good time for me. How about tomorrow? Or how about after the board meeting, which would have been the next day at 2 o'clock? Or again, if it has to be decided now, it may not be the best decision. And normally, I would say to someone, if you come into my office with a problem, also have some suggestions and some solutions, and we can discuss them. Because if not, I can always come up with a solution, but it might be a bad one, and we'll have to live with it. So what I do now, even when I've scheduled a Zoom call or a meeting with somebody, I always start out by saying, is this still a good time? Because life happens. And if the answer is no, I'll say, great, let's reschedule. Or if it's still a good time, and how much time do we have?
Yep.
Now, that's one of the good things about Zoom, by the way, because you can tell how much time has been allocated. But again, you don't always know that when it's a
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left. If you've got a question, who might have a question for Diana? If you don't have a question, I do, but if anybody has a question, I'll open it up. It's for you to ask Diana your question right now. You can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can put it in the chat box. Hey, Diana, we'll continue to wait for those. One of the things that I love about your books, and you can find Diana's book on Amazon, or you can find it on her website at dianapeterson-more.com, is that it's filled with case studies, real-time situations that you experienced, the real stories that you talked about. And
yeah.
the first, I don't ruin the whole case. There's multiple case studies in the book that I think are dynamic, but in the very beginning of the book and first few chapters, you talk about a pretty serious case study with a CEO that has found out some fraud is happening in her company.
Yeah.
And, she communicates to her, the executive assistant, but she does it in that quick, and she assumed some things that would happen. You were just talking about that time space that you have. And sometimes, as CEOs and business owners, we only have 5 minutes or 10 minutes at a time, and we're trying to rush. Is there any other, and you talk about a few tools in the book, but is there any other tools or best advice that you would give to us that when we're trying to communicate on the go, how do we do that more effectively? Or are there times that we say, hey, I shouldn't communicate right now because I really only have 5 minutes, and I know that if I communicate at this point, it's going to be, I'm not going to communicate thoroughly, and it's probably going to end up in a mess, or I'm going to make a bad decision. What best advice do you have in that situation?
Yeah, I think you've really suggested the solution. I think it's important. And the example that I have, a CEO is literally walking out of the office and giving a direction to a brand new assistant, and it really goes belly up, as we say. It's and it's a true case, and it was awful, and it had to do with contacting board members, etc. I think part of it is asking yourself, how much time do I have? And within that amount of time, will the message get across? And if I only have that amount of time, how can I be the most effective? I'm recognizing that it may go belly up. So what I would do is, if you have 5 minutes, is to say to the person, I only have 5 minutes, and this is pretty important and a top priority. So what I'm going to do is kind of explain what it is that I'd like you to do in about a minute or so, and then pepper me with questions, or tell me what it is you're going to do, what steps you're going to take. And then in that dialogue, again, instead of saying, oh, you didn't understand me, saying, oh, oops, I didn't communicate clearly. I really want you to do A, B, and C. To just kind of have an agreement at the end of the communication that each party knows what the other is going to do. The other thing is, I learned this probably at facilitator training school. Instead of saying, do you have a question? Because sometimes people tend to feel like, oh, I'm the only person in the room with a question and I'm going to sound dumb. I always say, what questions do you have? Which assumes that people have questions and invites them to ask them, especially with employees in that kind of situation. Just say, wow, I'm under the gun right now and I communicated so quickly. I'm not sure I was clear. What questions do you have? So again, you're owning it. I think it's so important to always own the communication. And even if you thought you were 100% perfectly clear and the person didn't understand, rather than saying, no, you didn't get it, say, oh, okay, let me try it this way. What I'm trying to communicate is X. Right. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Hey, we've got just a minute or two left. We did get a question from one of the attendees.
Sure.
I asked a question about during these uncertain times when we really don't know the end result and things are changing, hourly by hourly or
Yeah.
by day. Is there a tool that you would recommend or a methodology for keeping communication alive and active where it's kind of ongoing? It's not a finished product.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the
Like,
question.
how do you keep your team? I guess the piece of it is if I've got a team that's out there that's working from home remotely and we're trying to figure out, are we coming back or what decision are we making? And
Oh,
because it happens in real time. I mean, it's real time scenarios that may change by hour. How do I
yeah.
keep my team up engaged? And when they're still doing work and they're running at 100 miles an hour, is it town halls? Is it weekly check-in, daily check-ins, hourly check-ins? Is there a methodology that you found or a tool that helps the team understand what's going on?
Questions. But then I think you go back to the platinum rule of communication. How do people receive information? And do you need to have daily chats with a certain group? Do you need to have town halls? Do you need to offer all of them and say, I'm going to do a town hall at this time, I'll have a small group chat at this time, I'm sending out an email at this time? I think in addition to everything else the CEO needs to do to calm fears, it's all about the communication. And it's also about being honest about the communication. Um, I'm not sure what's going to happen. This is what it looks like now. And I suppose it depends upon where you are. I know in, I'm fond of saying, the United States of California, we have a lot of very pro-employee policies. And as an example, my youngest daughter was just told that she was going on 70% salary as of Monday. Well, I happen to know in California, and I'm sure now throughout the country, you can get partial unemployment insurance. So I said, well, sign up immediately and you can get partial unemployment insurance. So I think it's being kind of finding out what people's fears are and addressing them the best you can.
I think that's
I
helpful.
hope that's helpful. I know it's tough because I don't think there are any right or wrong answers. It's probably, all in Chinese menu, all of the above.
Well, I think your point about understanding, kind of prioritizing different people, what
Hmm.
are they feeling? What are they thinking? And then learning how to think about communicating to that group specifically those pieces of
Hmm.
information because that's what that platinum rule, that's what they're needing. I
Hmm.
think at this point, over communicating is better than under communicating.
Oh, definitely. I've always believed that. And the old, if you don't get them on the swings, get them on the merry-go-round. If you don't get them on the merry-go-round, get them on the slide. So trying different methods and modes to reach people. Um, and I think about, because I think about in the context of now facilitating people that I don't know. I'm actually going to do my first Zoom facilitation on Friday, a team building. So that's going to be very interesting. I use an instrument called the disc. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but I've been talking to the folks there because they actually have a cool ability now that they'll be able to send it to everyone's computer at a certain time, which is new. They didn't have that before. But that's going to be very interesting because how to keep people engaged and involved. And for me, it's asking a lot of questions.
Yep. Yep.
And also getting them, because adults, we learn differently than children. We'd never be able to sit in school, for 6 hours at a stint. We have to, that's why we get up and chit chat, go to the water cooler, get a cup of coffee, go to the restroom, do whatever. Adults learn in short chunks, but also they have to own it, and they own it by some sort of an emotional impact. So it's usually by getting them engaged or involved. So I would say try all of the above and see who responds to what and how.
Yeah, I think
And
that.
then make yourself available for one-on-ones. Most people won't take you up on it, but just knowing that it's an option makes them feel better.
Right. And to your point earlier about apologizing, I think a
Mhm.
leader, when they say, we don't know in real time, hey, we're making this decision or this is how we're leaning. We're trying to gather more data and more information. I think it shows a level of humility. It shows a level of authenticity. People can relate to that. They can understand. The leader doesn't have to have all the answers. They just want to know that the leader's there thinking about the answers. Right?
Well, and to know the leader is human, and we all make mistakes. So it's not if we make a mistake, it's how we handle it.
Mhm.
And leaders who don't own up, I mean, everyone can see right through it. And the power of showing your humanity means a lot to employees. You know what you don't know. This client of mine, I happen to be on the email chain, and he's basically an introvert. And so I know it's a struggle for him. He's smart as a whip. I mean, he's one of the smartest people I've ever met, actually. But the most recent email was to identify, they're an essential business, so they still have people on site, was that a family member of one of the employees tested positive, and this employee was being tested. Turned out the employee was negative. However, the CEO said, I understand there's probably a lot of concern. If you feel the need to take a day off or so, if you want to call me, he's working remotely, I'd be happy to take the call. So it was giving information, telling the truth, and making himself available, and then offering options.
Mhm.
So it seems to be working.
Right. Just a final thought on that, and then I'll let you go
Yeah.
today. But, I think the why behind why we make a decision is important in that communication as well, because sometimes we can communicate facts or statements, but people don't always understand how we came to those conclusions. And I think when we do that, it also brings a lot of clarity to a conversation.
And also, in a broader sense, the important role they play in it. Very briefly, I know one of the examples in my book came from, I do a lot of free training at the Center for Nonprofit Management. A woman told a story of, she was a secretary, worked for a nonprofit. The CEO said, I need you to stay late and I need you to mail out whatever, 100 letters. Walks out the door. She has a childcare problem, a single mother, etc. She says, I will never stay late again. Now think about it differently. Had he walked in and said, I know, because we know everything about everybody in the workplace pretty much. I know it's tough for you to stay late. It's really important. We're running a homeless agency here and we're a little bit underfunded. By you sending out these 100 letters, I'm hopeful we'll be able to raise $5,000, which will allow us to take one more person off the street, whatever. So to let her know that it was an important job. And then the next day, how did it go? Were you fined for picking up your child late? I'm hoping the overtime will compensate you. If not, I'll see what I can do. Would have been a totally different situation, having moved from an upset, angry, I'm only going to do the minimum to get by person, to someone who feels engaged, part of the team, and important. So.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. Hey, Diana, thank you very much. I do recommend her book. I do recommend your book. I'm a pretty voracious reader. Most people know. I love a lot of books, but I will say about your book that it was a book that I couldn't put down. That once
Oh, really? Well, thank you.
Enjoyed it. It was so practical. The case studies that were there were real. Was authentic. It resonated with CEOs and leaders. I saw myself in many of the case studies that you mentioned, and so it was really a practical read too. So I do encourage anybody that's on the call today, you can pick up her book on Amazon, or you can go to her website directly.
May I say something very briefly? It turns out that Amazon is out of stock of my book. One of my other clients who wanted to buy in bulk, 18 books, and it's not an essential function. So it's available on ebook, but abe.com, which is a subsidiary of Amazon, has the book and can print it on demand. I'm in dialogue with them, email dialogue, because the publishers in the UK, so there's a kind of hefty, it's called Book Baby, never heard of it, kind of a hefty transatlantic fee for shipping. So I'm trying to find out if there's a Book Baby publisher in the United States. And then the last alternative, and Amazon told me this, is just to put the order in, and when they're able to, they'll get to it. So
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pleased. It's a good problem to have, but it's not helpful because these are turbulent times and people may want to read it.
Well, that's why everybody's grabbed the book. They probably went
Yeah, probably.
how do I communicate right now? So, hey, Diana, I appreciate our friendship and partnership. Diana has
Oh,
written for our executive guide, and you'll be
as
seeing
do
some
I.
articles related to CEO and communication in future issues as well. So I'm
Thank
really
you.
proud of our
And I
relationship.
hope everybody stays safe, well, warm, and onward and upward, my motto.
Very good. And if you'd like to register for future CEO conversations, we are having another one on Friday. You can go back to the website,
Great.
register for that directly. So, hey, Diana, thank you very much. I look forward to our
Thank you.
future conversations.
Okay.
Thank you very much.